Man, we got a lot to talk about.
Yep.
Let's get right into it.
Let's do it.
What's your favorite mask?
My favorite mask?
Yeah.
Like,
I don't know. What's your favorite mask?
I was trying to think of something like witty there, but I just blanks.
You should have said like my Batman mask when I was in third grade. We do have a lot to talk about. Let's talk about it. What is that? Oh, that show on YouTube. Can you pizza a piece of barbecue meat? Let's talk about that. All right. So we had a pair session. It was an epic pair. We actually had a few epic pair sessions this week. I published one of them on my YouTube channel, edited it down. But there were some interesting things from both, so we wanted to talk about those. So the first thing we want to talk about was this idea of like a model. So we are building, we just pushed out the REPL v2, which is just lets you save REPLs on Mirage.js, and we use Hasura as a backend, and we have Sandbox model in our Hasura backend. It's a Postgres table, and it has 4 public fields, which are like just like the attributes of the model, like the body and the config and the request body, and the method and the URL. Request body, config, method, and URL. Then we have some things like a browser ID and an editing token and an ID as well. And so what we ran into when we were setting up this kind of auth system, like a userless auth system, is basically because we're using GraphQL and we just make queries and get POJOs back and forth, we started seeing this pattern in our code where we would have an ID attached to the model. We would like fork it and want to save it, and we had the ID on it still, and our backend was like, you can't save it because it already has an ID. You're trying to create a new sandbox with an ID. You can't do that.
Yep.
Which is nice to get that feedback. So like the typing layer in GraphQL is cool, and we're kind of new to that. But having worked with Ember Data a lot and also Active Record, we're used to using like having a notion of a model. And in both of those frameworks, Rails and Ember, the model has like an is saving state, is new state, is like you can reload it if you want to refresh it from the back end. And this new world of like GraphQL and POJOs doesn't have any of that.
Yeah. And the old world, you have an object with methods and data.
Yes.
In this world, we just have the data.
Yeah, because we're FP programmers now.
Yeah.
I actually got a tattoo that just says FP on it.
Nice.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense to anybody else, but so it's what do you think about that?
Well, as you were doing this intro, I was thinking about how I'm going to tell you you're wrong and how you need to convince me. So for what we're building, which is it's just we don't have a model in our app. We have like the notion of a model, the notion of a sandbox, which is a REPL. But we only have one thing. So we're not dealing with relationships. We're not dealing with, we're not dealing with relationships. So it feels okay. I mean, it feels okay to just have POJOs. And then when you go to like fork a sandbox or save a sandbox, you just create a new POJO with your new data and pass it to the save mutation.
Right.
I have a feeling that like, I like this. It feels fine now. It's simple.
It is simple. I will say, what?
Sorry, can we pause? Your computer's going haywire.
Oh, you want to check what it is?
Wow, that was weird.
Sorry.
Just shh in my
apparently
ear.
the cleaners at WeWork started hacking into my computer and using it to mine Bitcoin. So we had to stop that real quick. So the first thing I was going to say was the very first time I started using GraphQL and even just like React with Fetch like a year or a year and a half ago with my like recipes app, which is like one of the first things I built, I immediately made like a use recipe thing hook because I was doing this stuff and it felt messy to have all the attributes listed everywhere when they were the same and every time I created or saved or deleted or queried. And so I wanted to save those in one place. And I just wanted the route components to have a notion of like a model. So I remember doing that and it didn't like bite me, but it was just not the right abstraction, of course, and it wasn't really a problem. So I feel like every project I've done since then, I've tried to get more comfortable kind of what you were saying, which is just like, yeah, you know, there's times in our Ember and Rails apps where we only need one attribute on the details page or the index page, and we want more on the next page. And so you do partially loaded. I mean, we've been down that path. So the idea there is like, just be more explicit, basically, even if you have to repeat the attributes. So the last few times we've done that, like I've tried to be more like, embrace this approach more, where you just have, all this stuff. It feels like there's so many things that an ORM style library gives you that I would miss. So I feel like it's still kind of weird, but I don't want to jump to those until we need to.
I think there's a nice in between with GraphQL here. So like you can imagine you're building an app without an ORM, and like now you're writing like queries or fetch calls for finding like the join models, and then finding like the models that are on either side of the join. Mm-hmm. And then you compare that to something like Rails, and you're like, oh, it's so nice to say like, a post has many tags through post tags.
Right.
Like you literally can't beat that.
Right.
But like GraphQL, I feel like sits in between, because while we don't have like models in GraphQL, we are able to write queries that fetch nested data. So it's not like we have to query these three things like post tags, and posts individually. We can write one query.
It's higher level than like 3 select statements.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. We don't have to like, exactly. No 3 select statements and then like creating a data structure, wire those up. We can query posts and then like post tags nested, and then tags nested.
Right.
And get back all the data.
It is an abstraction layer over the database in a way that like just querying straight to the database would not be in like a Rails API. My problem is, so I get that, but my problem is more like pulling out type name, which we had to do, because the querying library we're doing returns you this __ type name property as part of your GraphQL response, and or as part of the response object that it gives you. And we had to do that a few times, and it just feels like it's at the different level of abstraction than the rest of the code that's around it. I think that's my biggest concern. We had a bug as well, which our test caught, because we're good stewards, and we test things when we can. But
say that with such enthusiasm.
The test took us a while. There was a few tests that took us a while to write, but the test caught a strange case where we had omitted a browser ID from one of the queries. And so that's the kind of thing that's like, I would like to see that in one place. And even you made a comment when we started, which was, we have these mutations and stuff that you'd like to see in other files, because that's how a lot of projects have it set up and recommend. And to me, that's the same thing. It's like the same thing. Basically, like the argument of making it more explicit, so the person who's working on this little drop-down panel, which is a new way to create an issue in GitHub, and they don't want to go through the full page with the form and share it, they just get to write their own thing. The GraphQL server tells them what's legal, they do it, and it works. But then again, so there's a tension there between wanting to like share those, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So yeah, that'll be interesting to see where we end up with that. But right now, most of that is just explicit code. I don't know. Is there a way to do like, can't you do types, or maybe even Hasura gives us types for like input adders? So we don't have to.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have our GraphQL schema locally in our project because we use that to see the test data.
Right.
So, yeah, there's like a lot of like hand waving I'm going to do, because I'm sure we have to set this up with VS Code and I don't know, like, does TypeScript give this to us? Mm-hmm. So, but yeah, it would be worth exploring. I mean, that would be really cool if we could just start authoring a GraphQL query and get all that autocompleted, not just the fields, but the input types.
That would be cool.
The variables. Yeah.
But the duplication doesn't really bother you.
There's definitely been times. So like when I load data, I don't think like, what is the minimal amount of data that I need loaded for this page? Because I just don't have that problem in my apps.
Yeah, agreed.
So there are times where I just want to like
find all recipes.
Yeah, exactly.
Find me recipe by ID 1.
Yeah, exactly. Import all recipes from like GraphQL/queries.js,
right? Something
like that. But then there's other times where, like, especially with Hasura, where I'm doing like aggregates or nested queries where it's not that bad to just write out the query.
It'd be the equivalent of like dropping down to SQL and Rails, maybe, where you need some more control. Not SQL, but doing a query builder. Let's say
exactly.
With active record.
Yes, query builder. Yep. And not having like, definitely not having the ORM or the active record pattern where you get back like objects.
With methods.
But being able, query builder is actually a really good way to think about that.
Yeah.
So I like it. Again, though, like the apps, the 3 GraphQL apps I have, the Mirage one is just one model. I have another one I'm working on that I'm just like testing Hasura with. And there's only 3 or 4 models and a bunch of relationships between them. And a third one that uses Amplify that it uses GraphQL, but Amplify it's all Amplify code. So
that's
I'm
more
not
like using an ORM.
Yeah, I'm actually not. So they have multiple. We're not going to have an Amplify discussion. They have 2 different APIs. One's an ORM API. The other is like a query API. So it is just GraphQL queries, but I don't have to write those queries. I can import them. They pre-generate them all for me.
Got you.
So I can just import them and call them.
Got you. So yeah, the queries doesn't bother you. What about the mutations? What about not having like a save method? And what about not having, is saving? I mean, to me, it's a little weird not having methods associated with the data, because then you have some things spread across, and it's
I mean, there's definitely like the classic identity map problem where it's like your name shows up in the header,
right?
And then you go to the profile page or your picture shows up in the header. You go to the profile page and you upload a new photo, and like, how do you get the profile page, which is like deeply nested, to communicate with the header?
Right.
Identity map nicely solves that.
Right.
I don't know. It just hasn't.
There's so much complexity in an identity map too. But it's interesting what you just said, because it ties into another thing we were going to talk about, which is the identity map solves a lot of problems, and it's great when some other library can do that heavy lifting for you. But as we've also found with libraries like SWR, if you can tolerate a little bit of staleness in your UI, you can massively simplify things, because you're not forking a store and comparing it and stuff.
Yeah.
So that header profile thing, if someone works on the edit page and they do it, and then you hit save, and SWR or Urkel or whatever is smart enough to know user with one change, let's just refetch. So yeah, you see the old image for a split second, but it doesn't matter. It basically
that's
as
perfectly
if
fine. Yeah.
And your app is in an inconsistent state, we would say, in the past. And it's in an impossible state, in the sense that you have user ID 1 and they are represented in 2 different ways in 2 different places.
Yep.
In that case, it doesn't cause problems. So you can sidestep it and simplify. However, we ran into an issue where we did have problems with things being out of sync. And that was with our code editor component being out of sync with some React state that was in React. Now, they were eventually consistent. So actually, that is a case of like stale while revalidate, because all the logic was correct in that React knew when to re-update and re-render, and eventually everything aligned. But because there was a render pass where the 2 things were out of sync, we had code that was basically using get derived state from props. It was comparing things because there's another time where they could be stale for different reasons, and we ran some logic there. So just thinking out loud, there was no way to differentiate if it was stale for like the right reasons, because React hadn't finished flushing all of its pending things, or if it was stale because like the user navigated the thing.
It's like stale, but don't worry about it because I'm going to update it in the next frame, or stale. You need to deal with this. It's stale.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that caused us a problem. And so we needed to spend a lot of time understanding why that was. Ultimately, I think it was because we were interfacing with a third-party library that, it's code mirror, which mutates the DOM so that it can give you all this text editing and all like code editing and highlighting and all this kind of stuff. And so there was this pass where we read from the DOM before the React state had flushed. So I don't know. There's just an argument there, which is like, maybe an identity map will help you in certain cases because you have this kind of guarantee about like canonical state and you're not doing this juggling as much. But yeah, it's kind of interesting to think about.
Yeah, I guess too, like when you have a bunch of just free floating mutations, no model layer, like you can always build up to that model layer.
Yeah.
And it might, it's not going to be perfect code, right? It's not really battle tested. You're just adding it to your app.
Yeah.
But doing something like an identity map for a sandbox, like we could wire that up with context pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Like that's not the end of the world.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess I like
it's better to err on the side of being explicit, and
lots of moving pieces.
Yep.
Another thing,
and you're writing it all, so that helps. But
Yeah.
maybe that's not a good argument because right now it's easy because we're working on a small app that we wrote. But it is easier to trace what's happening because all the code's right there.
Yeah.
So that is an argument. You're not diving into library code to see why does it think this thing is new or saved? I don't know. I'm just using this thing right here, my component, and I can trace it,
Yeah. The other thing about like having like all your queries and all your mutations like just local to what
Yeah.
you're working on is it gives you more control over like optimistic UI,
Yeah.
pessimistic UI. Like
Yep.
you don't have to just buy into this pattern. I know like with any data fetching library, you can tweak it and configure it to do what you want. But yeah, there's something nice about keeping your like optimistic UI mess just contained in a little component box.
Right.
So yeah, I think that's another benefit.
Yeah. Yep. It's interesting. I will say, like, with the React stuff that we're doing in the libraries we're using, being more explicit is less painful than it has been way back in the day when I used to. Like, when I first learned Ember, I was coming from Backbone. I had written this crazy survey thing in my own, like, router. And I was like, there's so much hidden complexity in, like, so many things that we do that I'm, like, totally bought into, like, using community tools and buying into conventions and not trying to just buy into how people do things, And I learned this lesson over and over. I've learned this lesson so many times that I don't question anymore. Like, almost to the point where I choose not to think for myself in certain things because you know what I'm saying?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. I could make this little drop down thing where I want to be, but I'm just going to ask Adam, or look at Tailwind UI to see how they did it because I know that there's a million edge cases they've hit into. That's like how programmer. I mean, that's what happens to every programmer, right? You just, that's what they say. Like the junior does it themselves. Like the beginner does it themselves. The junior says, all right, let's generalize and abstract it. And the senior is like, let's Google for, a UI drop-down library that already exists because they know how complex software can get. So all that being said, coming from that place where it's like, I always just feeling the voice in the back of my head when I start writing my own code. And we were just talking about this earlier today. Like you write your own code for everything. You're like writing a lot of code to do something like this that seems pretty like universal to like every app. And there's edge cases you're missing, you're making a mess. But with React, it's fun. That's part of it. It is fun. It's a lot of fun. But it's also like less painful than a lot of other times I've done it in the past because of the way the mental model is and the way that the problems surface in a more apparent way that you never hit that wall. When a problem surfaces with a mess of code that you've written, I feel like I never don't know what to do next. Yeah. I think we've talked about this before too. Whereas there's definitely other tools I've used where it's just, okay, if I'm going to like stop right here and just ask someone or open an issue or open a Stack Overflow because I just don't know what to do next, or I'm not willing to like dive into this layer of this third-party library or whatever.
It's interesting. For me, the something like Rails, I just want to use the community solution that solves 95% of the problems because I think I've mentioned this before, but that's like, it's battle tested.
Yeah.
We know the best way to store data in a database. We know the best way to query relational data.
Right.
So I'm all in on Rails. Where with like the front end stuff, I don't think we know the best way to fetch data from a server.
That's true.
And so having the, just having the escape hatches to like for me to write a fetch call or just use a GraphQL library that only returns a response. It doesn't do any identity map or any normalization.
Right.
That lets me, explore.
Right.
So
better part of the trade-off.
Yeah. I mean, it's so true. Like the front end apps we work on, the way we approach apps today would be different than 3 years ago.
So different. But like,
I don't think that's true with Rails.
It's
not true with Rails.
And it's definitely not true with like database modeling. One-to-one, many-to-many, one-to-many, polymorphic. Boom. IDs, foreign keys. Everyone's going to agree. And you just said, you just kind of, again, related to this note, and something else we wanted to talk about was after we finished these 2 pairing sessions and got the REPL working and tested and everything, and it seems to be working really well, and we're happy with what we ended up with, it was just like, we changed a lot. Like I worked on it myself over this weekend, and we like paired on Monday, and like we changed a lot. We changed it from our first version. We changed the functionality, of course, that's why we were working on it, but we also changed how we did things because we had learned a lot.
Yeah.
And so you made this point, which was like, you were just like, man, if I had to go build an app that did this, like, and you built it, like, it wouldn't look, I wouldn't end up with what we ended up with. Neither of us would have, which is the beautiful thing about pairing. But more deeply than that, you would end up with something that looks much different, as opposed to, I think, if 2 Ember developers or Rails developers were told to make something with that set of specifications, that those apps would look much more similar.
Yeah.
The code would look a lot similar.
Yeah. The whatever architecture, I hate that, but the design of the app.
Yeah.
Where maybe there's different component names, but as far as like the data flow in the app, they would look the same. Yeah. And I think
using get drive state from props versus effects and how you think about that stuff.
I think you're being charitable with what I said, because what I had said was, I seriously don't like what we wrote. I don't think I could have wrote something like that. Like, I don't think I could have created something like that.
Me neither. I mean, I finished it over the weekend, but it was wrong. It had a bug that I didn't find until we did it. And then I realized there was an error in the way that we had done things because of how we set the state. I used an effect to set state, and it was rerunning for different reasons that I hadn't anticipated, which is what happens a lot of times.
Yeah.
Which I don't know if we talked about this on the podcast or on the stream, but I remember this happening with the toggling of the side panel in the docs on just the table contents and stuff. And we used an effect with React Spring. And again, like the thing changes for reasons you hadn't thought of. And so it caused a bug that it also exposed a state you hadn't considered. Yeah. So that helped us, but it also exposed a bug that wouldn't have existed if you had just been more imperative. And so basically, this is what happened again with this, where we're using an effect, and it was rerunning because of an object reference being recreated on render, and it was triggering the effect for reasons that we weren't thinking. And then we refactored another part to use get drive state from props, which is an API from before, but in hooks, it's just setting state during render if a certain condition is met. And often it seems like that is one way to solve a problem, and an effect is another way to solve the same problem. So, it's interesting. There's a lot of options there. There's a lot of decisions you make when you write this stuff.
On the get derived state from props thing, I'm going to just, So first, like the docs say, you don't need this.
They say, you shouldn't. They say you should not. Something like you should not be using
don't
this.
Need this, something like that.
Yeah. Which is like you're probably thinking about this wrong if you reach for it.
Right. And then the other thing is like, okay, the setter, it's called, you have like, use state, and it's like first name, set first name. Mm-hmm. So it feels side effecty. Mm-hmm. And so the fact that you're setting things during render
when we're being taught
just feels wrong.
When we're being taught to be pure in render. That's the whole point of useEffect. That's the whole point of concurrent mode and strict mode. So that's being drilled into our heads. And so,
I want to be clear that I'm not saying calling set state during render is a side effect. I don't think it is.
Right.
But it feels that way. Right. It feels like, this should be an effect. I'm reacting to a new prop. And so I have a place to do that. It's effects.
Right.
So yeah,
Right.
it feels off.
Which is why I reached for it when I was coding over the weekend on it. But yeah, we've done this like 3 times now, and even outside the REPL, and it's a really nice solution. Like it makes a lot of sense. Also, like runs on the server. So if you think about doing a one-shot render and effects being things that are kind of thrown away and not part of like the pure, and you do one pass render of your app, you want it to be consistent with the given input state, then like this stuff should happen basically, right? So that's another interesting way to think about it. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it's pretty funny. And like, I think you made an interesting point, which is just like a lot of the stuff like UI development stuff, we don't know as well as we do in the back end. And like when people make database modeling mistakes all the time, right? And you reach for these crazy things, and then it's like, oh, why don't you just put it in a new table and make a foreign key? Oh, like as soon as you get that, it's like, boom, so many things clear up. You're doing CRUD on resources again. You're not doing all this other stuff. That's like in the Rails guides, and they use that similar language, which is like, you might be tempted to do like add comment, but like really you make a new thing and use a polymorphic relationship and it works, right? So I think people like us who've had experience with that see that in the React docs and we think, oh, there's really something I'm missing here. But I feel like over the last year plus of working on React, it's like I've had that happen, and then it's like, but there's no link to like the answer, because there is no answer, because people are figuring things out a lot. So there's not always consensus about how to do things, and there's not always best practices that are established.
No. React actually takes the opposite approach, and it's just like, and I'm not, this isn't criticism, it's fine, but you should figure it out, and if it works for you. Like these are tools if they work for you. An example of this is not setting effect dependencies. And using the ESLint rule. That's in the docs. You can use this, but then there's like a sentence after but you probably shouldn't. So it's like, which is it?
Right. No, I agree. And that's like, I think that's evidence that this stuff is still being figured out, right? So it's evidence, the fact that like dependencies and an effect aren't auto-generated for you is evidence that this is like new territory, and there aren't like answers the way there are with Rails, which is a 10-year-old battle-tested framework working on with database technology that's 40 years old, you know.
And maybe, and yeah, to be fair, like it kind of, dumped on the docs there, but to be fair, maybe that's, just tell people this is how you do it. If you get stuck, you should probably not use get derived state from props, but it's there if you need it.
Right. I'm trying to think like what's the action step here? Keep fiddling around and having fun until it works.
I mean, the takeaway that I had from our pairing was like, there's just a lot, like get derived state from props is helpful. And there's a few situations where like we need to recognize it. Yeah. So it's like you're trying to, what was like the big takeaway? It's like you're getting something like an ID into your component, and you need to like reset some data. You don't need to use an effect for that. You can just use get derived state from props.
Right. Exactly. Like if you have a page component that's rendered REPL/ID or post/ID and someone hits next, you need to reset some state because the component doesn't unmount, and instead of using an effect, maybe it's just easier to use get derived state from props.
Yeah.
Also, there's just so many problems that are like just from client-side rendering, but it also enables a lot of cool stuff, of course. But it's just funny. There were some of the things in there in those tests that was just like the 404 page, you know what I mean? Like that in a server rendered app is just so much easier. Just so much easier. You're not thinking about, there's just a lot of states in UI.
404 is so hard. It's so hard in client rendered apps. Client and server rendered apps.
Yeah.
First.
And isomorphic apps.
Yeah.
Even worse. That was fun. If you're interested in that, I have a video on my YouTube where we talk about some of the stuff we learned, which I thought was pretty cool. I learned a ton from that, but we shipped that. That was fun. And this was another point about the code editor. I think a lot of the times, the very first time I worked on the recipes app and we rendered a form where you pass in the recipe from the parent and you start editing it and you want to change it, you're instantly back in this situation where the parent owns the state. You pass it into the form. You need to change it here. So you have a decision to make. Is this guy a dumb component? I hate controlled and uncontrolled because I never know what they mean. Is this guy a dumb stateless component that is that uncontrolled? No, it's controlled by React. That's a different thing.
It's controlled, uncontrolled is like an input.
Who's setting the value. The DOM and the state, truth and DOM or whatever. Is this form a dumb stateless component in the sense that it takes in the recipe and as soon as you make a change, it sends on change, but it doesn't change state. It just sends an event. And the parent uses the event handler to update the state, which flows back down and re-renders. Do you do that? Or does the form hold on to its own state? So it basically gets derived state from props because it gets in the recipe, it seeds its initial values with that, and then as you're changing it, it does it. So you instantly have this decision to make, and then you have to think about what happens if the parent changes while I've changed.
Yep.
And
there's also different types of changes in the parent. Like if the parent changes the recipe's name, what do I do? That's different than if like the parent changes the recipe's ID.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. I'm wondering if like get derived state from props would actually be just very easy. And like I was trying to use an effect in my recipes app to watch for ID changes and reset the state, and it was like so gnarly, and like that would make it so much easier.
Based off our pairing session, this is no doubt in my mind. This is a get derived state from props problem.
Yeah.
Actually, the real answer here is to use Formic because they all do all this for you. But
that is the real answer.
If I had to like think about this and how I would build this, I think to get derived state from props. If the ID changes,
if ID doesn't match my recipe.id, then it's
I'm
basically
overwriting my fields.
Right. And that's kind of like, it's nice because it feels like a hard refresh. If you could just, another thing that we tried, that we did, that actually made it work, was use the key prop, which I hadn't thought about and you brought up. And I was like, really, when we change REPLs here, that's what it was, because we were like navigating between two REPLs without unmounting the page, and we hadn't thought about that yet, because there's actually no way to do that in the UI. But if you hold the browser button back and go back to in history, React will do a client-side navigation. It'll change the version or the ID, but nothing will unmount. So if you haven't thought to reset state, if any of those IDs change, you're going to have a stale code editor. And I was like, man, really, I want to just like flip back to loading for a second, or just like re-render a new version of REPL with the new data, because the data is accurate, but like it's just stale in these weird ways. So you could argue those like leaf components aren't respecting the data flow, and that was true in that case. But I was just like, there's a lot of times where you write a component and you're not thinking about the data flow right away, and it's just way simpler if you can just render it first. I bet I could find bugs in almost any React application with components that don't respect the data flow, that have no visible bugs because they only happen to be rendered.
But they only have one path.
Exactly.
I mean, useEffect in a class component world, absolutely. UseEffect is supposed to solve this, but even so,
yeah.
I mean, just given how many effects we see that skip dependencies.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly.
So
just to finish, like you were like, you could always use a key. And I was like, oh shit, key equals, param ID, and then boom, you're done. And it works. The problem is it does unrender and re-render a new version, and we didn't want to lose a state. So we ended up doing the harder work to make the code editor component respect the data flow and think through how to do that if the params change so that it can respect it. And that's better because you end up with a more robust component that can be used anywhere in the app. And no matter how those params change or what state it has, it will reset its internal state if it needs to. It'll do what it needs to do.
I think maybe like 6 months ago, I saw a tweet from Sebastian saying that you should use a key prop for like master detail views.
Oh, really?
Like this. Yeah. And Ryan Florence replied and said, yeah, I think I'll find the tweet.
Yeah.
I might, and I maybe it was like 2 tweets, but I remember like Ryan Florence saying like, yep, this is like no brainer or something like that.
Really?
Or he said something like, he did it in his React Conf demo and it like just made things so much easier.
Really?
Yeah. For some reason, I mean, I know these people are better React developers than I am. For some reason.
I only have 4 years on you.
Yeah. For some reason, using the key prop just feels like it's like an admission of I can't code this UI.
Yeah.
I like refuse. I refuse to like.
I will write
no,
9 effects in this component before I use key to make my.
I mean, there are some.
No, I 100% agree. Also, it's like you just lose in the case of the code editor thing. You're forfeiting the opportunity to keep the state persistent, which in the case of the REPL is actually like a desirable feature in the sense that you click save and you don't want the screen to flash or whatever. So that's, to me, that's like not always, it might not even be just another way to solve the problem. It might be, you might be compromising some part of the UI or some way to show something that you wouldn't be able to do if you use key. Yeah, key feels like a bad escape hatch.
It feels like a chainsaw. You know, when you're like, you're working with like some like video component and it just has all this internal state, like some in React, some in the DOM, and you just like want to take a chainsaw to it. It's just like key, some ID.
Yeah, like exactly. Like the playhead is at like 8 minutes out of 12 and then you switch IDs and like the video player is still there, but now the video is only 4 minutes long and it's just like, you're just like, that is when you want to just say like, I don't want this thing to stay across videos, just re-render it. But then again, like that's not true because like an Ember map, if you set the video speed to 1.5x and then you click the next in the series, you want it to remember that. So that's the whole reason we do client rendering is so that you can have state that lives, that is long lived. That's what enables experiences that aren't possible without it. So it feels, that's why I think both you and I are pulled to struggle with this stuff, even if it's frustrating, because it feels like if there's a way to do that, you should be able to. And yeah, it's like you said, key is like an admission of failure. I mean, shoot, like, could you basically get rid of every effect in your app and use key everywhere? Because that would just basically be avoiding re-renders. You're basically just doing initial render. And so, except for like a fetch, I guess.
Yeah.
But like
there
anything that looks at props that change and rerun when the props change, like instead if you just always keyed things and made a unique key for the component based on what
off every prop you can cat every
yeah exactly
prop
it's like a surrogate key for your components.
Yeah, but then you lose internal state.
But so that's whatever. So we don't care. Just use key.
Wait, if it's a dumb component that has like no internal state, it only takes props and sends actions out. What's a React equivalent of this? It takes
like day down actions or whatever. Yeah.
Then one way keying is totally fine. But if you have internal state like buffered changes,
but then you wouldn't key it. You wouldn't key it. You
wouldn't key it. As soon as the key changes, that state just.
But that's the point. Like,
well, you might receive a new prop, and you don't want to lose some state.
Yeah, I guess so. Unless it's tied to the URL or something.
I think there is something worth talking here, where it's like if you have a component that's rendered. And you render another version of that component with new props. And these two components, they're the same component, but those two renders have nothing to do with each other. So like you're looking at like you're viewing like profile with a prop of user ID 1.
Yeah.
And then that user ID changes to 2. There is a point where it's like maybe you should just key it because these things like they're completely separate. Like there should be no states that's shared between them, nothing. And so, yeah, maybe there's like a argument for just...
It feels like two ways of solving the same problem because, I mean, it feels like an escape hatch. It feels like...
two ways of solving
it feels like any time that you use a key to do that, you could not use a key and write the correct effects to update things in the way that they're meant to be and in order to be consistent with the new props. And therefore, that's how you should do it.
Right. And the reason you should do that is because while today the IDs should never change, the components should never stay the same when the IDs change.
One day you might want to share state across renders. One day you might want not to flash it or whatever it is. Yeah, exactly.
You've got like some little timer internal to the component that doesn't care about IDs changing.
Yeah.
And that's internal to the component. And if you change a key, you lose it.
Exactly. I need to rewatch this if this is in one of Ryan's talks.
I'll find the
I have
tweet
a vague
so
memory
you
of
can
it.
put it in the show notes. And but there was discussion. I was like, this is interesting because it's not just something I didn't expect.
Yeah. If it's a pragmatic argument, I'm fine with that. Like, it's so hard to reset all of the video state just when the ID changes. I'm writing all this effect code that says if ID2 doesn't match ID1, reset all this stuff, and I'm just doing it because I have to, but I would really like to just render a new video player. I get that pragmatic argument, but in that case, you almost think it's like, yeah, you almost would want that on default on everything, and then like once you actually need to keep state, you like opt into it because it does make things easier. It's almost like a refresh render of your app every time.
I mean, some things do this, like Next.js and Gatsby, the pages being keyed. So like similar elements between them get torn down.
Yep.
I don't know if Next.js keys the pages. I know I do in my Next app for frame or motion.
Yep.
But I know Gatsby keys the pages. I know if you want to get away from that, you have to.
You know what's interesting about this? You know how you just said like if the component was a dumb component and didn't have any state, there's literally no difference?
Yeah.
If you key a dumb component, it doesn't matter because there's nothing persisting from one render to the next. There's no state in the component. Correct?
Yeah. I mean, there's going to be people that are like screaming at that.
On mounts or something?
No, like you would lose, if it was a list, the key can help be smart about reordering the HTML elements.
I don't understand.
So like,
if what was a list?
If you were rendering a list, you were like mapping over an array of data. I think you want to use, you have to use key, but I think you want to use key because if the last item goes to the first item, you can just the reconciler can just say, oh, okay, I'm just going to move this component instance up there.
I'm just taking a simple case. I'm saying you said earlier, if there's no state in the component, then keying it and throwing it away when the props change doesn't cost you anything. It's not.
I'm saying Latane wave reconciliation and all that. But from like a
from a perspective of the behavior of the program.
Yeah. I think so. Yes.
It's just kind of interesting that like the whole goal here is to have like renders of your app that are consistent with the state of the app. And in functional programming, isolating state and moving it to edges is like a good principle, and having like stateless functions is like a good principle. So it's interesting that the more of your React components are stateless, the less of this kind of thing you have to worry about. And I was just thinking like, isn't it, I wonder if it's almost like a problem how easy React makes it to add state to components because you're not nudged in one way or the other.
I know, but then where do we end up here? Like a Redux store?
Yeah,
the
basically.
root that holds is checked.
Yeah, basically.
Shoot me now.
Just an interesting thing though, because the problem stems from state. You know, it's just interesting. Anyways, that was we learned a lot. There were some frustrating parts, but I feel pretty good about what we learned and where we ended up with. What?
It's like there were tears, there were high fives.
There were high fives. Yep. Went through a lot this last week. Pretty fun stuff though. You know, now that we've done more React and Next and stuff, it might be fun to look at like, you know, the headless UI thing I was looking at earlier today that Robin and I think maybe Brad from Tailwind Labs have been working on. It'd be pretty interesting to see how they wrote their code. There's some interesting things in like Tailwind blog, which is a Next site, I think, that Brad wrote, and Brad has done a lot of Next stuff. I think he's been using it like every day at work for like years before he started Tailwind Labs. So
nice.
And
I think when we convert MirageJS.com to Next, I think that is going to be our reference material.
Yes, I agree. I converted my personal site from Gatsby to Next, but there wasn't really much going on there. It's not the same. It's not generating server, at build time API docs. It doesn't do two different kind of headers and stuff. Just random buggy things that we've had to fix in the Mirage site. So that'll be interesting. But it'll be like a good test of like what you were talking about, which is, how different does two React developers component looks like? I had this idea for Ember back in the day, man, that I wanted to do, which was like embertechniques.com, because it was like, yeah, there's just so much we don't know. Let's have like a Stack Overflow style site where I need to make a drop down. How do I do it? Set the state and position it in a way that like it hides, it doesn't render when it's there. I can transition it and stuff. And then you let people submit answers and then like let people vote on them. I think something like that for React could be really cool because the problem space is just huge. I mean, people are making all sorts of stuff these days.
How do I build like a form that buffers its changes?
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
That would be awesome. And yeah, I mean, yeah, use Formic again. Like,
no, but
it's the answer. But I want to know how I should be thinking about these problems.
Yeah.
So I think that would be super.
Also, would Formic help us with the REPL? We have a code editor thing.
Oh, I didn't think that far.
I'm just saying. I think there's a reason. My point was there's a reason we didn't reach for Formic when we worked on the REPL, and it wasn't because we were like, oh, let's do this ourselves and have fun coding for a week. It was because we didn't naturally get a point where it was like this would help us solve this problem because we're building a code editor. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So you still need these ideas. Man, the buffer, just as a side point, when we were working, we had named these things like initial sandbox and sandbox. They were derived from like useQuery. When useQuery returned, we set them both, and then we called set sandbox every time we made local changes. Then we realized we didn't need really the initial sandbox state. We could just derive it from the query. And that sounds obvious, but there was a reason why it wasn't. There was a reason why we felt like we needed that, but then we realized we didn't. And then we renamed sandbox to buffer. I feel like just naming things correctly brings so much clarity. Once it was like, oh, wait, this is a draft. Oh, yeah, we have the server side thing. Anytime you query something, you want to just keep it around as a reference to the last thing you query from the server. And if you start mutating it, it's not the same thing anymore. So just have a separate thing, call it a buffer, call it a draft sandbox, buffer sandbox, draft article. And it's like that pattern is just, that's the kind of thing I would like to see abstracted, something that knows its ID. You can have like multiple revisions. You can have an opportunity to resolve conflicts. If the server thing updates, you don't blow away your state. You save your draft in local storage. I feel like there's a nice abstraction somewhere there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's funny that Amplify's data store ORM has all these features, but yet you want
badass.
You want the thing that's not like
all or nothing.
Yeah, exactly.
You want to be able to write your query in Urkel.
Right. You want that.
Throw that into something.
Their ideas abstracted into a library.
Right.
I think they I don't know. They might say that like you do need the server component because you need to track like last updated at and version and
we need to know what those things are.
Matters. Yeah.
Interesting. Cool. Well, lots of cool React stuff. Let's just hit our last thing here really quick, which is just that we do want, while working on this, we have been struggling with like Gatsby reloads and just the build time and just all the plugins there. And there's something about all that feels like we're using the wrong tool for the job. So we're interested in maybe rewriting it into Next. And one of the things was this 404 page. So we had this bug when we first clicked the merge button finally on like our 3 days of work, like 3 full days, over the course of a week or whatever. And got the version 2 of the REPL out, which was like the 404 page. And we had it on both versions of REPL, V1 and V2, because you have to go to Gatsby node and call create page because we're using a dynamic route and we match against it, but there's no file in the static output build that our server Netlify can actually render. So when the page loads, Netlify doesn't find anything and it returns a 404. It loads the app, which then recognizes the route because it matches a dynamic segment, and then React renders the right thing. And so there was this flashing 404 page only in production. And, I know Ryan and Michael's project Remix lets you, in development, they show you server render just like it will be in production. So that's a nice little thing there. Because that's both a problem with Next and Gatsby, is that during dev, you're not actually seeing what's going to happen in your server. So that was a surprise, that caught us by surprise, even though the app still worked, because eventually when React rendered, No, I mean, it was broken though. I mean, the initial it looked ridiculous. So.
Yeah. And there's a weird translation piece here, right? Like Gatsby builds HTML files. So files are like files have an absolute path.
Yeah.
There's no file that's like star.html.
Yeah. Exactly.
So this is, the way they solve this is with like a plugin system.
Yeah.
That you use based off your hosting provider to basically create redirects or create Nginx configs that do like the wildcard matching.
Right.
But yeah, it's hard. We only see this when we go to production.
Exactly. And the files there, the code that you use to create those things for the dynamic routes aren't co-located with the code you're working on. So
yes,
it's not clear. And we were just like, man, the server rendering stuff is great. I mean, I remember when we first used Gatsby, we were blown away by the fact that it just automatically server rendered your React app because we had just spent so long getting our Ember app to do that. And
then we became entitled React developers.
Yeah, exactly.
Spoiled, entitled React developers.
Exactly. And, but as we ran into issues like this, like when we ran into this one with Gatsby, we were saying to ourselves, like, if I'm going to have stuff like this, I'd rather just go with the Ember model because we never had to deal with any of this stuff before we started server rendering our Ember app. And there's something really nice about that. You're building like a mobile app, basically. You're building like an iOS app. It's like an iPhone app that runs, it's just a JavaScript app and it's a white screen before the code loads and it doesn't matter, basically. You render a loading screen first for the whole app and it's no problem. Many apps do that. And there's something really nice about that because server rendering does introduce a ton of complexity. Also a ton of benefit, but a ton of complexity. So it feels like if you're in a Gatsby world where you hit these things, we talked about some consulting work we had done where we had to deal with this as well. It's just a pain in the butt and I'd rather like not even deal with it. But especially for something like the REPL, which is literally like a client side thing. It's like it's not sending a content link really, but then you want titles and whatever. Anyways, it felt like you either want to do one or you have a good solution. And it was just, it was like we were happy when we thought about the next solution, which is really nice to this, which is to actually have a file with bracket ID. So there's a file there and it's just another beautiful design decision of the Next framework that solves this problem like really elegantly.
Yeah. And I mean, Next providing hosting, you don't have to use Vercel, but I mean, boy, does that just make all this easy? Yeah. And I think there is a link. I think when you have dynamic segments in statically generated sites,
you need to own.
You want your hosting provider to be aware of that. I don't think, just install this Netlify plugin and then create a redirect in this node file. There's even though like conceptually I can explain it to you, I know exactly how it works. I know what it's doing.
It feels like you're not working on your app anymore. Yeah. It feels like you're working on infrastructure or so another layer of your app that is not why you're using this framework. You're not like that feeling of just getting to focus on my app. You've lost me.
You're not working on your app. It's you finish your app, you go to deploy, and then you have to fix these issues. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. That's a huge problem.
Yeah. It's funny. You say like, it feels like you're working on infrastructure. And I'm like, well, infrastructure isn't that bad. You sometimes have to know about it, but you're not like building a feature. Yeah. Yeah. That's what you mean by it.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. No, the whole point of like Next and Vercel is like, you just write your app code in like index.js or like routes or whatever, and then you just deploy it and it all works. So, which you get with Ember, when you just do it on the client because you have it working and then it's just static. It's literally just static files. There's no funny business going on. There's nothing extra until you try to do server rendering. But like, that's not really what I would, if I needed server rendering, like I wouldn't use Ember, but like there's other apps that use Ember that, it makes sense because there's a lot of assumptions you can make when you're in the browser, right? And you don't have to do window checks and all this weird stuff. Just the feeling that the Gatsby thing was like an uncanny valley, and I'd rather be in one camp or the other. If they can't get it right, then don't do it at all kind of thing. It kind of felt like that. I mean, that's not fair, but I'm just saying it's like time taken away from the value that I'm working on, the features I'm working on.
I think where
And
they
it feels
drew,
like their problem to solve, not mine.
yeah.
But now I'm solving it.
Well, it's interesting. Whose problem is it? It's like Gatsby, you, the app developer, or the web host. It's someone's.
It almost feels like if I was going to have to do those kinds of things, I'd rather them just point me to a guide which tells me how to server render my app by calling like React render to string, and then you have to figure out where to put those files. And you know what I'm saying? Because like, you're taking ownership of it.
That's a big leap.
That is a big leap. But I'm just saying it's just, you don't, it's that moment where you hit the wall and you're diving into the source of the other thing. And I didn't set any of this up, but now I'm basically like debugging it in some sense. I'm configuring it and debugging it, and I didn't write any of this, so it doesn't feel good.
Yeah, they drew the boundary of we're going to generate a static version of your site, and so if you have dynamic segments, you need to tell your web host how to deal with that. But yeah, it's
so they don't have an API for dynamic.
They do. They have it's basically
Programmatic.
what create redirect is. So
But you have to put it in a page.
No. So they have this create redirect API that says like you can go from like from posts /star to this post component.
But like we have
but however, like that when you're generating files, that's meaningless. Like you could generate that's just meaningless when you're generating files. So, but like your web host is going to have a great way for you to do that. They're going to have like Nginx config or what Netlify has like their own TOML configuration, which is great. But so now you have to like figure out what pages you're generating in Gatsby that have dynamic segments and then how to translate those into the redirects of your hosting provider. So with us, we have Netlify plugin redirect, and that's going to create a Netlify TOML. And that thing is literally going to say like anything that comes to /REPL/v1/star renders this HTML file that Gatsby created on disk.
Yeah. Or we do the create page thing that we generate something called REPL v1 REPL shell, which is an actual file in the build.
That is the actual file that's in disk.
So you don't need a redirect at that point.
No, we do. We have a redirect that says anything.
They
call it a 200 redirect.
Right.
Which
because
is
it's a page with a dynamic segment. Yeah. But I'm talking about even just defining the create page and having the page in the build, also, which is like our Gatsby site is a little weird because we render the same app component. We render the whole app on every page, and we have like a dynamic thing that uses reach router or React router to do the rendering. So it's like SPA style. It's basically an SPA.
Yep.
Our Gatsby site is an SPA. Most Gatsby sites are not. They fetch code for different pages.
Yep.
But it's like, I guess that's a little bit of a confusing way to say it. But our code is...
Here's the way. Every page has a nav bar, and if you scroll halfway down that nav bar, it's a horizontal nav bar, and if you scroll halfway down that nav bar, and then you go to another page, we want to maintain that scroll position.
Yeah, exactly. So we don't use the pages. What my question is if you were to start a brand new Gatsby app and stay on the happy path, they basically have two ways to create routes, which is like put a pages / put an about.js in pages, or if you need a dynamic thing, you have to.
That's where create redirect comes in.
That sucks
because
it's
it's
dumb.
The boundary is like they give you files on disk and you. Yeah, I mean, yeah.
The next approach is just so much. Hopefully, they just steal that because it's just ridiculous. That's ridiculous.
Well,
that's why we forget about it every time this happens.
But like again, this is where I would say like whose problem is it? Is it Gatsby's problem?
It's Gatsby. Rails. When you define routes in Rails, there's one way to do it.
No, but Rails is like a server, so Rails can get a URL and know exactly what to render.
If creating files isn't going to suit every need, then you need to just use an Ember approach to define your routes. You know what I'm saying?
So that's fair.
Yeah.
Like Ember Fastboot has an app server, so it gets a request and it knows what to serve out. I don't like Gatsby wants to be a static site generator. Hold on. Ember
is a static site generator. When you run Ember build, you get a static site.
I'm talking about the server rendering. The server rendering of dynamic segments. This is a gotcha. And
You
Ember
can't have Gatsby without server rendering. Like, unless you do what we did, or unless you do something crazy. All I'm saying is, like, Gatsby has an API for defining routes, right? Which is like create pages, unless you have a dynamic segment, and now it's something else. I think that's stupid. I think that constraint should have been use the least powerful thing to create routes and pages that accomplishes all of our needs. Now you have two ways to create pages if you happen to need a dynamic segment. So they could have done something like Ember did, and instead use a routes file where you define your routes, and then there's some convention or ways to point it to pages that it renders, and then it could handle dynamic segments as well.
But they still no, because they
yes, I could.
At the end of the day, they want to give you a bunch of HTML files. They want to say, here's your static site.
That's fine.
But they can't handle HTML files aren't enough to do dynamic segments. If you have posts/slug and you don't.
No, I get that you need a server to have you still need a server redirect.
Yeah, or a server.
I'm not even talking about that. I'm not talking about how to serve it. I'm talking about the user land API for creating pages. That's what's bothering me, because I think it's silly. And this is I'm trying to express in words the feelings that I have associated with Gatsby. I feel like I'm in a therapy session.
I know.
Why
I'll just validate you. Right?
Why do Gatsby's APIs bother me? And this is like this is a little example, because if I was writing a library for you, an application framework where you define routes and render things there, and it worked for like half of your things and then not another, I would just go to the other. It's like, you drop down a level and give them the low level thing that works everywhere before creating a high level abstraction. That's a bad abstraction. It's like the pages abstraction is actually a bad abstraction because it doesn't cover all the use cases.
It's I was reading something. I think Gatsby is rewriting their like routing API, and I think it is going to be all file based, similar to Next.
Okay,
doesn't solve the hosting issue.
Yeah. That's fine.
Yeah,
that I get that that's not something they can solve on their own.
Okay, I see. So okay, I was definitely talking past you there, but yes, I see where you're.
Yeah, the API, that's frustrating to me. That stuff angers me.
Yeah, I mean Gatsby, like you have to know, you have to know all that stuff.
Exactly. It's a lot to know. It's like in Mirage when you have like shorthands that work, except that they don't. So it would have been way better to ship the other thing first, so people don't have to feel like they have. That's the worst feeling, man. When you're using a library and you're getting momentum with it and it works, and you're getting familiar with these few APIs, these 3 or 4 methods and functions that you're using, and then you hit a use case that feels like it's the same kind of thing. It doesn't feel that different. There's a great example in Mirage right now, actually, which is if you want like root disabled and embed disabled, but you still want foreign keys, it's ridiculous the jump you have to make. And it doesn't make any sense why. You have to create a whole custom serializer, get the JSON, and then like strip them out yourself. It doesn't make any sense. So that's the kind of thing that's like, those are bad APIs. I'm being critical, not to pick on Gatsby, but more to try to just say like the mistakes I've made in the past in my open source work or my code is to jump to those high level things that are appealing too fast, but are risky. They're risky because they don't cover everything. And
when you hit that edge
it's
case,
worse than if you didn't have those. Even if those high level APIs saved you time at some point, it becomes way worse because now you lose confidence that you know what you're doing. You lose confidence that the high level APIs are even saving you.
I lost that confidence a long time ago.
That you even know you're doing that the high level APIs are even what you want. It's like maybe that's why we always say React is fun, because there's like 3 APIs in React, honestly, right?
Yeah. Fair.
And you have to write a lot more code than you would in an Ember or probably a Vue or probably an Angular. But
you're always using some version of those APIs to solve every problem. And they build up on each other. But okay, the Mirage example is really good because you're saying that like the thing that I'm about to do next is similar
Yes.
to this configuration, to this API I just
Yes.
used. However,
It's missing.
to actually make it work, I have to jump to like a
3 levels down.
25 line file, and it just doesn't feel like, wait, hold on. All of a sudden I went from creating a file on disk to represent a page to going into a node file and having to call like create page and all this stuff. Okay.
Whereas in React, useState, useEffect, useState. Okay, it's getting
let me
big.
put
Just
it
move
into
it into another thing. But
yep.
it's the same thing. So you never hit that, oh God, now I have to use mutation observer. Like, I hate when I have, like, that's a whole new, that's a dark section of the docs that I've never had to read before. It's just like useState and useEffect. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and keep combining those.
And it's like, there is very confusing and difficult to understand emergent behavior that comes because there's only those two things. For example, our code editor uses an effect to import. Let's hope it's still working. Our code editor uses an effect to import code mirror from like the actual library, and then it initializes it in the DOM, and then it has to use another effect to set things up. And there was a thing we ran into where there's a series of steps, and so there's this emergent behavior that's very confusing, can be confusing, but you have to understand it, and all the code's right there. So that's, again, what makes you feel like you don't lose momentum. So just kind of interesting to think about.
I mean, really great observation.
Thank you. I try. I might not be able to code anymore very fast.
I never get stuck, but I make a huge mess. I mean, maybe that seriously, like, that's not a bad thing.
It's not a bad take. That's my hot take for the year. It is nice that the messes that you make are your own fault, because they're like these crazy like use sandbox things that don't make any sense. That's a different kind of animal, React Spring feels like a different kind of animal, but that's like, again, it boils down to effects and state. So in your own app code where you're using those things, it's interesting. I'll have to mull that one over. Maybe I'll roll that up into a little thought piece, put it on the old blog.
Well, I was going to say, this might be a good YouTube video.
Yeah, that would be. Ding.
Yeah, there you go.
That'd be a fun one, actually. All right. Clocking in around an hour and 12 minutes here. I think we can wrap it.
The last 20 minutes, we just went.
We went off the rails, man. You know what? If I can't go off the rails on my own podcast, our own podcast, where can I? I'm just going to sit here for 5 minutes watching this person in this window over here. One of the best parts about living in New York is all the weird crap you see just by looking out the window. I sometimes wonder if there's footage of me, I don't know.
I think that's just
naked cleaning up.
I mean, everyone that's lived in New York City has seen that, and
everyone who's lived in New York City has seen me naked cleaning up in my living room.
Has always seen some version of.
Wow. I was thinking, like, if someone's like doing that, going to work to get that to happen, it's like, all right, you deserve it. But I didn't realize everyone in the city had seen that. Now I know why my dating has been dried up the last few weeks.
Dude, in our old building, we had like unobstructed view, and then they built a building next to us.
Nice.
And it was like, wow, you can see.
You just change the channel every night.
It's like, you remember those like ant colony things that you get as like a kid?
Yeah.
It's like that.
Mm-hmm.
You just see it all. You have a fly on your face.
I thought it was a piece of hair. I went to sip my drink. Is it still there?
No, it's gone.
It's like Rear Window. I rewatched that recently, actually. You know that movie? It's an Alfred Hitchcock
it's like
movie.
I haven't seen it.
Yeah, and that's what it is, because it's like, it really is like that here. It's funny. All right, well, thank you so much for watching, those of you still here. Tell us what you think of the new lights setup here. We spent a little bit of time doing this, but we like to waste 2 hours every time we set up for a podcast.
One of us does.
Oh, wow. Maybe we do need to go to a therapy session here soon. All right, y'all. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week. Bye-bye.